Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if you need to believe in God to be a good person? It's an old question, right? Many people still think that morality, what's right and wrong, is tied to religion. But what about people who don't believe in God? Do they just make up their own rules as they go? Or do they have a shared sense of morality too? This new study dives into exactly that, exploring the moral compass of non-believers across 10 different countries. This study dives deep into what non-believers, people who don't believe in God, think about right and wrong, and where those ideas come from. It is a big question because, sadly, atheists and non-believers are often seen as morally suspicious in many parts of the world. Some people even worry that without a divine authority, morality might just become a free-for-all, with everyone deciding what's right for themselves. But is that really true? The researchers here wanted to see if non-believers, just like religious people, might share some common moral ideas even across different cultures. They looked at how nearly 1,000 non-believers from 10 countries described the basis of their views on right and wrong. What they found is pretty fascinating. There is definite diversity, which is to be expected. But there are also some cool patterns that pop up again and again, no matter where people live. These patterns are about what moral principles are important and where people feel that morality comes from. This study challenges the idea that not believing in God automatically means you're a moral relativist, or that you see morality as just something you personally built from scratch. Instead, it points to the importance of social connections and agreements, like a social contract, in shaping what people consider right and wrong. The introduction sets the stage by telling us that a lot of people believe you need to believe in God to be moral. This often leads to atheists and non-theists being viewed with suspicion. The worry is that without a moral anchor or divine guidance, they might fall into moral relativism, meaning what's right or wrong is just a matter of opinion. However, research is starting to show that this isn't necessarily the case. One survey found that people who don't believe in God were just as likely as others to disagree that what is right and wrong is up to each person to decide. So, if not God, and not just personal choice, then what's the foundation for their morals? That's the big question this paper aims to answer. The paper then dives into what previous research says. A lot of studies show that non-believers are just as concerned with morality and ethical behavior as religious people. They score just as high on things like empathy, and there is no real evidence that they are less moral or altruistic. Where they do tend to differ is in their moral orientations. Think of it like different flavors of morality. One way to look at this is through theories like the big three: modes of morality, autonomy, community, and divinity. Autonomy is about individual rights and fairness. Community is about interdependence and duty to your group. Divinity involves natural order and sacredness. Non-believers tend to focus more on autonomy values like caring for others and fairness, while religious people often score higher on community and divinity values like loyalty to the in-group and respecting sacredness. Another useful framework is moral foundations theory. This suggests 5 basic moral concerns: care and avoiding harm, fairness and reciprocity, loyalty to your group, respect for authority, and purity or sanctity. The first 2, care and fairness, are called individualizing foundations and are important to pretty much everyone. The last 3, loyalty, authority, and purity, are called binding foundations, and they tend to be more emphasized by religious individuals who focus on group cohesion and tradition. So, the general picture from psychology is that non-believers are strong on individualizing morals like kindness and fairness, but may not emphasize the binding foundations as much. Some even suggest that things like purity and sanctity aren't really part of a non-believer's moral makeup. This idea is echoed in research on personal values. Values are like guiding principles people use to make choices. Non-religious people tend to score higher on values that focus on the self, like independence and creativity. Religious people tend to score higher on values that focus on social order, like tradition and security. However, when it comes to valuing others, both groups tend to agree on caring for people, but non-believers might have a broader sense of concern, extending to universalism, meaning caring for everyone, not just their own group. Some research also suggests non-believers lean towards consequentialism or utilitarianism, where the morality of an action is judged by its outcome, the greater good. Now, while psychology gives us broad categories, this paper wants to go deeper and hear from non-believers in their own words. They point out that most previous qualitative studies about non-religious people focus on how they define themselves against religion. Some studies found that non-believers often mentioned honesty, treating others considerately, justice, and compassion. A really interesting finding that pops up in several studies is the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is a principle that many non-believers find important, even though it is often associated with religion. Some also believe morality is hardwired or based on science and evolution. The key takeaway here is that the picture of non-believer morality is complex and probably more varied than we assume. So, how did they find out what non-believers think? They ran an online survey asking people who identified as non-religious and non-theists this question. If not a belief in God, what important view or belief do you hold that you base your concepts of right and wrong on? They recruited about 100 people from each of 10 different countries, trying to get a good mix of cultures. They specifically screened out anyone who said they believe in God. This table shows the participants. We've got people from Australia, Brazil, Canada, Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, the UK, the Netherlands, Turkey, and the USA. Most of them were highly educated and generally not very spiritual, even though they identified as non-religious believers. They had a good gender balance too, with a few exceptions. To make sense of all the open-ended answers, the researchers used a systematic coding process. Experts in each country first categorized responses from their own country. Then they combined these into a big cross-cultural list of categories. Finally, they had independent coders go through everything again and checked for reliability, meaning they wanted to make sure everyone was categorizing responses similarly. This careful process helps ensure the results are solid. Now, for the exciting part, what did they find? The study identified the top 15 most frequently mentioned views about the basis of right and wrong. Let's look at the top few. The most common answer by a significant margin was kindness and caring. People emphasized empathy, concern for others, and doing good things. This was followed closely by acquired morality, where people said their morals come from what they learned from parents, school, law, or history, basically social learning. Then came the golden rule, which we saw mentioned as important before. Fourth was aggregate flourishing, which is a fancy way of saying aiming for the greatest good or well-being for the most people, often linked to utilitarian ideas. Fifth was reason and critical skepticism, believing that morality comes from logical thinking and questioning things. And right after that was personal experience and feeling, including things like conscience and just figuring it out through life. They also identified other key sources of morality for non-believers, such as equality and human rights humanism, a belief in intuitive morality that humans are naturally moral beings. Secular morality, meaning you don't need religion to be moral, science, caring for the earth, and connection to others. The researchers went a step further and used a statistical method called principal component analysis to see how these different beliefs clustered together. Think of this as finding common themes or patterns in how people talked about their morals. They found 6 main patterns. The first one they called rational morality, where people based their morals on science and reason. The second, flourishing of life, focused on ensuring the well-being of all living creatures and the planet. The third, personal and social moral compass, combined personal feelings and experiences with learning from society. The fourth, intuitively social animals, suggested that our morality comes naturally because we are social beings shaped by evolution. The fifth, individualizing rights, emphasized individual liberty and equality. And the sixth, secular morality, highlighted that you don't need religion to be moral. They also looked to see if things like gender, age, or where people lived made a difference. Interestingly, gender, age, and education didn't show huge differences across the board, though there were some subtle trends. For instance, women were more likely to emphasize kindness and equality, while men leaned more towards rational morality. Younger people were more interested in aggregate flourishing, while older people mentioned intuitive morality more, but where they did find significant differences was in cultural background. Nationality mattered, for example. US Americans and Canadians were more likely to mention kindness and caring and the golden rule. Turkish participants, however, mentioned the golden rule less, promoting the greater good. Aggregate flourishing was more common in the US and Finland. The Finns also really emphasized equality and individual rights. Looking at the aggregated patterns, Denmark had higher scores in rational morality, while the US stood out in flourishing of life. The Czech Republic and Turkey had higher scores related to personal experience and conscience. And interestingly, Denmark scored highest in secular morality, though this related more to how Danes discussed being good without God rather than explicitly criticizing religion. The study notes that Danish participants sometimes identified as cultural Christians, meaning they adopted Christian values because they were integrated into Danish society. This highlights how complex the lines between religious and non-religious can be. So what does all this mean? The study confirms that non-believers have diverse views on morality, but there are also recurring patterns. They identified key moral principles like kindness, the golden rule, and equality, and sources of morality like social learning, personal reasoning, and intuition. Crucially, the study found that while many non-believers see morality as socially constructed, this rarely equated to moral relativism. They don't necessarily think that any moral rule is okay. This challenges the stereotype that atheists are inherently moral relativists. The findings also suggest that non-believers don't always define their morality in opposition to religion. While some studies have found this paper shows that mentioning the need for religion to be moral was not a dominant theme. Instead, the golden rule is a significant meeting point, utilized by non-believers across cultures as a foundation for morality, sometimes even drawing from their cultural Christian heritage. The research also offers a nuanced view on moral foundations. While non-believers, as expected, emphasize individualizing foundations like care and fairness, the study also shows that some non-believers hold universalistic concerns for the greater good of humanity or the planet. This goes beyond just individual rights and touches on ideas of community and interdependence, but in a broader, parochial way. The author suggests that existing measures in moral psychology might sometimes oversimplify these differences, perhaps by focusing too much on narrowly defined binding foundations or by averaging group scores. They also raise an interesting point about the purity and sanctity foundation. While typically associated with religion, some non-believers in this study spoke of the sacredness of life in nature, suggesting that this foundation might exist in secular forms, but needs to be measured differently. Now, it is important to acknowledge the limitations. The study primarily surveyed active non-believers, those who are members of secular organizations or actively seek out non-religious communities online. This means the findings might not represent all non-believers, especially those who simply lack belief but aren't actively involved in secular groups. The authors rightly call for more research using representative samples to truly understand the breadth of secular moralities across different cultures. Ultimately, this study offers a powerful counter-narrative to old stereotypes. It shows that non-believers, far from being amoral or solely self-interested, often base their sense of right and wrong on shared principles like kindness, fairness, and the golden rule, and that these morals can be acquired through social learning, reason, personal experience, and an innate sense of fairness derived from our social nature and evolution. It reminds us that morality is a deeply human endeavor, capable of flourishing outside of religious frameworks. It highlights that the social contract isn't just a religious concept. It is a fundamental human idea that guides behavior for religious and non-religious alike. And that's it for this episode of RUBIN'S Mind Lab. What did you think of these findings? Do they align with your own understanding of morality? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this interesting, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for more science breakdowns, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the human mind. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.